Now, real quick, this video is very long and is jam-packed with a bunch of information, so please, please, please use the timestamps below in the description and in the pinned comment to help you digest the information that I'm just rambling about, okay? So, let's get on with the video. Okay, so we have probably what I consider to be the most exciting drug when it comes to treating androgenetic alopecia that might give a drug like Finasteride a run for its money. And in this case, we're going to be talking about a drug developed by Kintor Pharmaceuticals known as GT20029 or GT20029, 2029, whatever. Now, this is a protac drug which stands for proteolysis targeting chimera. And the reason why it's interesting is because it attaches a protein known as ubiquitin to the androgen receptor in your dermal papilla cells along with other hair follicle cells. Now, the androgen receptor is important for signaling to these very important cells to essentially tell the hair follicle to stop growing hair or to miniaturize and, reduce hair quality when DHT attaches to the androgen receptor on these cells. So by removing the androgen receptor, you're essentially preventing DHT from transmitting its negative signaling that would cause your hair follicles to wither away and ultimately die. So as a quick summary, GT229 is destroying these receptors by using the body's own garbage disposal system. And it should be noted, these receptors aren't permanently removed. Your body still is going to produce these receptors because androgen receptors are proteins, and your body still has the genetics to produce these androgen receptors. However, it'll just take some time for your body to replenish these receptors, and in doing so, all the while, if you're still using this drug consistently, in theory, it can blunt hair loss and probably even stop hair loss for some people. And we're going to be looking at some of the positive signals coming out of the clinical trials and also dermatology conferences that Kintor attended. According to Yang et al.'s presentation, titled, quote, Safety, Tolerability, and Pharmacokinetics of GT20029 Gel and GT20029 Solution in Healthy Subjects, unquote, this was a phase 1 Chinese clinical trial that tested GT2009 in both a gel and solution in healthy volunteers, and it found low systemic exposure. There was no systemic exposure after a single dose of the gel application, and since most blood concentrations were below the lower limit of quantification, the pharmacokinetic profile stayed very low even after multiple dose applications of the gel or the solution. Now, people don't know this, but Kintor actually presented this at the European Academy of Dermatology and Venereology Congress 2023. We can get some more information from Kintor's Chinese Phase 1 top-line report, which gives a cleaner numeric version of this, saying that after a single dose administration, all subjects had no detectable drug concentration below the lower limit of quantification of 0.001 nanogram per milliliter. After multiple topical dosing, the mean maximum drug concentration of all cohorts stayed below 0.05 nanograms per milliliter. And that's very important. The United States Phase 1 data also tells a similar story, but in a broader group. That Phase 1 clinical trial for the United States that Kintor performed on GT229 is titled, quote, Safety, Tolerability, and Pharmacokinetics of GT229 following topical single ascending dose administration in healthy volunteers and multiple ascending doses administration in subjects with androgenetic alopecia or acne, unquote. What a long title. But the Phase 1 United States trial evaluated the topical single ascending dose administration, as the title entails, in healthy volunteers and also multiple ascending doses. And again, we're witnessing minimal to no systemic absorption in the United States Phase 1 top-line results. So, in the United States clinical trial for GT229, after a single dose administration, all of the sample concentrations from the subjects were below the lower limit of quantification, in this particular study being 0.003 nanograms per milliliter. After 14 days of repeated dosing in androgenetic alopecia or acne subjects, the highest mean concentration did not exceed 0.015 nanogram per milliliter. So if we compare the China and the United States phase 1 data, it's pretty consistent. The Chinese version showed a very low systemic exposure in healthy volunteers with the gel and the solution version of GT229, and the United States study showed very low systemic exposure too, but included healthy volunteers from both the acne and the androgenetic alopecia trials. And this makes sense because if GT229 is able to work on the scalp by removing the androgen receptors and helping hair grow, for more hormonal related, acne issues, you could possibly use a drug like GT229 to also ameliorate that particular condition too. You can also see this being the case for topical anti-androgens, similar to CB0301 clascoterone, as we see in Winlivy 1% concentration, and now for Breezula's topical anti-androgen being clascoterone, Breezula, I think it's 5% topically applied twice a day. But in any case, going back to the GT229 discussion, it seems clear that the action of GT229 is mostly local, with very little of the drug reaching the blood, and that's pretty important because when you're talking about deleting the androgen receptor, well, you have androgen receptors throughout your body. So if you're messing with those, that could cause a lot of issues, not just with libido, but also your strength, right? Muscle wasting would probably become a thing because then testosterone cannot act upon the muscle cells and also other parts of your body too. So the androgen receptor is very important. So it's encouraging to see from both the Chinese clinical trials, right, and the United States clinical trials that GT229 is pretty safe. It's not going systemic. It's not causing problems. And I know there's this conspiracy where people like to say, well, it's in China, so, they could be doing fraud over there. Well, they also did the clinical trials here in the United States where you have third-party, CROs that are supposed to be conducting these trials, right? The FDA has oversight. They're checking the data. So it's not easy for, a foreign company to try to pull a fast one on the US FDA. So that goes without saying. But now that the safety aspect has been established, what's even more exciting is that we have published clinical evidence showing that GT20029 is giving clinically meaningful results. According to Yang Hu et al. In the European Academy of Dermatology and Venereology Congress 2024 abstract presentation titled, quote, Efficacy and Safety of Topical GT20029 Solution in Chinese Adult Males with Androgenetic Alopecia, unquote, 180 Chinese adult men with androgenic alopecia scores rating on the Hamilton-Norwood scale from 3 in their vertex all the way up to 5 were randomized into 6 groups. Keep in mind, these 6 groups were also measured against placebos of each group. So we have the once daily arms, so the concentrations of the drug that was taken once daily in those groups, and we also have the twice weekly arms. So for the once daily arm, we have 0.5% GT20029 once daily was compared against the once daily vehicle placebo, and 1% GT20029 once daily was compared against the once daily vehicle placebo. So pretty simple, right? The twice weekly arm, it pretty much mirrored the once daily arm with the exception of instead of being once daily, they applied the topicals twice weekly in both the 0.5% and the 1% concentration against a twice weekly vehicle placebo. So yes, all in all, you had 6 different groups. Now, back then, Kintor simply announced that they were testing these concentrations, and this was in part for their phase 2 clinical trial for GT20029 in China, and that this would be a 12-week trial. Well, now we essentially already have those results, and I made a video about this before, but the results were very encouraging. In that phase 2 androgenetic alopecia study, all GT229 groups improved hair counts from baseline, but only 0.5% once daily and the 1% twice weekly clearly beat their matching placebo groups at week 12. The 0.5% once daily group beat the placebo by 6.69 hairs per square centimeter, while the 1% twice weekly group beat their placebo by 7.36 hairs per square centimeter. Hair width also improved, with the 1% twice weekly group showing a statistically significant improvement in target area hair width at week 12 compared to the placebo. And these results were later published by Hu et al. 2025 in the peer-reviewed Journal of Dermatological Treatment. So taking that into account, we have two very important things that are pretty much confirmed right now. Very low systemic exposure across the Chinese and United States phase 1 studies. But also, we have a bit of a pharmacodynamic signal, a positive signal going on here, and this is mostly tied to the phase 2 clinical endpoints like the hair count and hair width. But if they did something like a biopsy that shows proof of androgen receptors being degraded inside of the follicle, or a sample subset of the follicles that were being exposed to GT20029, then that would make for a more promising pharmacodynamic sort of signal. I'm not saying the current signal that we have right now when it comes to hair count and hair width improvement does not suffice, but the biopsy would certainly put an end to that question. Now, I should point out that the phase 2 studies, it does have some pretty odd inconsistencies. The first inconsistency is that the 1% once daily GT229 application did not clearly outperform the 0.5% once daily application, even though you would normally expect for the higher concentration to perform better. The second inconsistency is that the twice weekly dosing schedule looked more dose responsive than the daily schedule. So in other words, 1% twice weekly looked stronger than 0.5% twice weekly, while the daily groups did not show that same clean pattern. The third inconsistency is that the 1% twice weekly group looked like one of the stronger groups, even though it was applied less often than the daily groups. So that suggests that more frequent application may not automatically mean better results with a topical protac like GT20029. But these inconsistencies can be explained in a few ways. First, we need to acknowledge that this was a small exploratory phase 2 trial with only 30 people per group. That means random baseline differences and noises can easily distort which arm looks best. Also, with a topical protac like GT229, more frequent dosing may not always mean better results. If the drug degrades androgen receptors and the biology takes time to reset, which means that it takes some time for your body to, replenish those androgen receptors in those cells, then the twice weekly dosing might be enough. It probably isn't going to do any better than the daily dosing. And, daily dosing itself may add irritation and also variability or simply no extra benefit. But when you take into account the differences of the groups where they started at in terms of their hair baseline, their hair count baseline, it starts to become more, rational. The results kind of make more sense the way they played out. So the 1% daily group started much lower, at about 105 hairs per square centimeter, while the daily placebo group started at 119 hairs per square centimeter. That's around a 14 hair per square centimeter disadvantage at baseline. So that group may have had a worse starting point in terms of their hair density or more variable androgenetic alopecia severity in that group. And that can make the results look weaker even if the drug is doing something. And we can clearly see in all of these groups against placebo, the drug is doing something. There is a positive clinical signal here. So don't take that as this GT229 data is not doing anything. There is some sort of clinical defense against DHT. By contrast, the 0.5% daily group started closer to placebo at around 116 versus 119 hairs per square centimeter, and then gained more by week 12, and that makes its placebo-adjusted results look better. The twice-weekly groups were also more balanced. The 1% twice-weekly group started at around 117 hairs per square centimeter compared to about 120 hairs per square centimeter for the twice-weekly placebo group. But the placebo twice-weekly group only gained 4.57 hairs per square centimeter, while the 1% twice-weekly group gained 11.94 hairs per square centimeter. So guys, the inconsistency here may not be that the higher dosing failed. It may be that the daily placebo arm had a bigger placebo response. The 1% daily group started at a worse point, and the study was small enough that the baseline noise may have distorted the dose response. Really, the twice-weekly arm looks more convincing because the baseline was more comparable and the placebo response was weaker. In any case, we are seeing that GT20029 might provide some kind of defense against DHT. The question which larger trials will need to explore is how strong this effect really is in a larger group over a longer period of time. 12 weeks is enough to see a positive signal, but androgenetic alopecia is long-term, so the real test is whether this keeps improving or plateaus or loses strength over 6 months to about a year. So right now, between phase 1 and phase 2 in both the US and Chinese clinical trials overall, we're getting the idea that it has a systemic safety, but also some sort of clinical benefit. Now, the question is, will this replace finasteride or dutasteride? I think that's still up for debate, but let's explore this a bit more. Look, we already know what the androgen receptor does in androgenetic alopecia and how dihydrotestosterone, also known as DHT, modifies the cells involved in hair growth in people who are genetically prone to having this alopecia condition. But there's another receptor that may have its own unique hair loss related actions on the hair follicle, and that is the GPR133 receptor pathway. And for the sake of simplicity, I'll just call it GPR. A recent study titled, quote, "Single-cell transcriptomics reveals hair growth retardation mediated by apparent connective tissue sheath contraction in male androgenic alopecia," unquote, by Lee et al. 2026. And it suggests that DHT may not only act through the classic androgen receptor pathway. The study used spatial and single-cell transcriptomics and argued that hypercontractility of the connective tissue sheath activates the piezo-type mechanosensitivity ion channel component 1, or piezo-type 1, protein, and this protein acts as a cellular touch sensor. When it opens, it allows ions like calcium to go into the cell, and from there it triggers other biological signals and mechanisms that tell the cell to react in a certain way. According to this study, when DHT combines with the GPR receptor, it increases the presence of this particular protein, and this in turn induces apoptosis of hair follicle progenitor cells and suppresses matrix and outer root sheath cell proliferation. And remember, these cells are very important. You have to remember, when your hair is growing or when it goes through its growth cycles, the dermal papilla cells have to send a signal into the epithelial strata of your tissue structure. And there, your hair follicle stem cells exist in the hair follicle stem cell bulge. Now, those signals make the hair follicle stem cells want to migrate towards the lower architecture of what would become the hair follicle unit. And in doing so, it has to transform into various cells, and these cells are just colloquially called progenitor cells. And then these progenitor cells can differentiate and become other parts of what would build the hair follicle, such as the matrix and the outer root sheath cells. So if DHT is messing up with this particular process, where it's killing these progenitor cells and it's suppressing the amount of these cells that can actually migrate to form the hair follicle structure, well, then what's going to happen is you're having another pathway in which your hair follicle is essentially miniaturizing, undergoing some kind of fibrotic stress, reactive oxygen species, etc., etc. All of these bad things we don't want to happen to our hair. Another interesting aspect of the study was the gene knockdown portion. Now, knockdown is an experimental technique used to reduce or temporarily suppress the expression of a specific gene without permanently deleting it. In this case, they performed the knockdown on either the GPR receptor or the androgen receptor in balding early anagen human hair follicles taken from the hairline. The GPR knockdown had the broader improvement, so we saw more consistent, markers of hair growth expanding in that particular hair follicle cohort. So you can consider how dihydrotestosterone caused the connective tissue sheath to go under this sort of hypercontraction state. And because they knocked down the GPR sort of gene, right? Now this receptor isn't being expressed as much, and they expose them to to DHT and such. It's pretty interesting to see that the authors state it significantly reversed the negative sort of inhibitory markers on proliferation. So in simple terms, the GPR knockdown saw the greatest and more broader improvement in cell health when it came to these hair follicles. For the androgen receptor knockdown, it alleviated the DHT inhibitory effects on the hair follicle growth itself, but the more important aspect is that it did not alter the connective tissue sheath contraction. So these sort of fibrotic markers still existed to some extent. In both cases, the growth markers improved, but the mechanical restriction was still what remained for the androgen receptor knockdown hair follicles. I think the more important message here is that the GPR pathway seems to also signal to the hair follicle to stop growing or to stop having these very important cells migrate to where they're supposed to be. It's clear that the mechanical stress in other hair disorders can lead to follicles weakening over time. You see this in, traction alopecia being the most famous example of that. And even other sorts of alopecias that, outside of their inflammatory aspects, take folliculitis decalvans, it's also the mechanical pressure on the hair follicle due to the excess inflammation that's also damaging it in its own right. So we're having a demonstration that, hey, it's not just the androgen receptor here that's involved in this sort of balding process. And because of that, it still might be better to just overall lower the local dihydrotestosterone or DHT activity, given its seemingly dual effect on both the androgen receptor pathway and the GPR pathway. So it's wrecking your hair follicles on both ends. And this line of thought has led to many people thinking that topical anti-androgens might not be effective because, well, they're only blocking the androgen receptors. And for that matter, they're not doing anything to the GPR receptor. So for that reason, that still leaves another route for DHT to still do some kind of damage to your hair follicle, and those anti-androgens aren't doing anything, so once again, it makes more sense to just reduce the overall DHT load in the hair follicle, because after all, treating androgenetic alopecia is as simple as reducing the instances in which a DHT molecule interacts, in this case, not just the androgen receptor, but also the GP133 receptor. So for that matter, we're trying to reduce the instances in which the DHT molecule interacts with these crucial hair follicle cells. And we can do that by broadly reducing the substrate in which DHT is created, which would be reducing 5-alpha reductase by way of using a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor like finasteride or dutasteride. The other way would be by blocking the androgen receptor with an anti-androgen like KX826 pyrilutamide, CB0301 clascoterone, or even RU58841. And now this new proposed protac method would be to remove the androgen receptor. And these are all doing the same thing. They're reducing the instances in which DHT is interacting with these crucial hair follicle cells that we need to survive to make our hair grow better. But that being the case, again, the GPR pathway is still a functional issue. Now, granted, I don't think there are studies that show anti-androgens are binding to the GPR receptor. We need to see more evidence on that. If that's the case, then that would be pretty interesting. But no, we don't have any anti-androgen data on that. But the important part about this study by Lee et al. Is that the GPR receptor mechanism is not centered on the dermal papilla signaling. In androgenetic alopecia, it is the defective dermal papilla signaling that is impacted by dihydrotestosterone, and this primarily starts the balding process and also prolongs it. So the androgen receptor pathway still seems to be what is most impactful to me, right? They didn't even mention that GPR133 was, an important pathway in the dermal papilla cells. It could be, but they didn't mention that in the study at all. So still, androgenetic alopecia is very much an androgen receptor dominated pathology. Because I think this limitation is worth pointing out, that the Lee et al. Paper, they're not observing a fully intact scalp environment. a lot of their strongest mechanistic work that they're showing is done in isolated human hair follicles in an ex vivo organ culture. So that means they just took it out of a human scalp. And then they went on to graft it onto humanized mouse graft models. And this matters because there could be some sort of dampening or sort of silencing of the dermal papilla signaling, because the dermal papilla signaling is highly dependent on native follicular niche. So you need a good amount of the original tissue in order to, properly supply the vascular support, the adipose tissue, the nerves, but also the immune tone, right? The immune system interactions would probably allow for the dermal papilla to signal properly. So it's kind of hard to know what exactly we're observing here. All we're really observing here is that when it comes to contractive tissue, that DHT can negatively impact that absent of any proper dermal papilla signaling. And if that's the case, that's not necessarily saying that GPR133 DHT receptor pathway is important and probably just as important as the androgen receptor DHT signaling pathway. But it could just be that we don't have enough dermal papilla signaling context to even rule out if the androgen receptor is now lesser in terms of its importance when it comes to the pathophysiology of androgenetic alopecia. I'm not convinced. I don't think this particular study by Lee et al. Is showing that. Once again, it could really just be the case that without that, tissue, the ample amount of tissue structure, native tissue structure, you're losing a lot of those dermal papilla cells and how they would normally interact. So if you're not getting enough of those dermal papilla signaling, then maybe GPR133 becomes much more relevant in terms of how it looks like it's damaging the hair follicle. So who knows? And the authors clearly point this out because the dermal papilla data looked relatively muted. The authors reported that the dermal papilla subcluster distribution was broadly comparable between healthy, non-balding, and balding follicles, with the main dermal papilla defect being a reduced angiogenesis-related signaling. And this is why I find it very hard to believe the outcomes of this study, and I think it's just greatly exaggerating the role GPR has when it comes to androgenetic alopecia, because, and even the authors are also acknowledging this, when we look at the dermal papilla cells in the temporal region or the hairline region versus the occipital region, so the occipital is typically healthy and doesn't have any sort of androgenetic alopecia defects, we see that the dermal papilla from the non-balding area of the occipital region is much more healthier, it's ample, it's bigger in size, as opposed to the hairline temporal area where androgenetic alopecia primarily impacts. What we see, right? We see a smaller dermal papilla structure. So I'm not sure how this study, and again, they purport that, the dermal papilla structure is the same between the balding and non-balding area. This is a major contradiction of androgenetic alopecia literature. It's just so contradictory that I, in my opinion, think it's enough to kind of just say maybe they did something improper when it came to biopsying the tissue. They didn't get enough of the tissue context for us to even conclude that what we're seeing is uniquely, this weird Frankenstein laboratory approach that over-exaggerates GPR133 DHT receptor activity and how it destroys the hair follicle. In other words, I think the androgen receptor DHT pathway is much more relevant, and with that being the case, that means GT20029 might be more relevant in terms of being a hair loss treatment. So if you actually want to look at that study comparing those dermal papilla regions, you can look at the study titled, quote, androgen receptor-mediated paracrine signaling induces regression of blood vessels in the dermal papilla in androgenetic alopecia, unquote, by, strangely enough, G. Lee et al. It's pretty much the same team that did the single-cell transcriptomics that revealed the whole GPR thing, right? So I find it strange that in a previous study they did, they were able to do proper biopsying and they were able to get, what essentially matches the ample amount of literature, yet somehow here in this new paper, they weren't able to conclude that. Maybe their methodology in this new paper was poor when it came to properly assessing the dermal papilla cells and if they were able to extract an adequate amount. I don't see how that isn't being pointed out here, because clearly, and they have the images to prove this themselves, the non-balding dermal papilla is significantly larger. It has much more cellular activity than the balding dermal papilla. And now all of a sudden in this new paper of theirs, they're essentially telling us that there were no differences between the non-balding and balding areas in terms of their dermal papilla structure. I don't know about that. Now, it could be the case that in some people, an overactive GPR sort of signaling might create a condition similar to frontal fibrosing alopecia, which in some biopsies can show overlap with androgenetic alopecia, but this is far from the majority of people, and typically in those biopsies you're seeing signs of lymphocytic infiltrate that's consistent with lichen planopilaris. Also, this could perhaps be a characteristic of only certain hair follicles on the scalp in certain areas, like the hairline. They didn't fully examine the vertex, for example. They didn't examine, every single region of the scalp. Basically, these were early stage miniaturizing hairs, and not every stage of androgenetic alopecia across every patient or across the entirety of a patient's scalp might react the same way. And we know just from anecdotal experience, from scientific literature, tons of data that states essentially the hairline might be the hardest area to restore in hair loss therapy. So maybe GPR is much more relevant there, or hairs that share a genotype with the hairline. So if you think about it, you could have been born with diffuse and pattern alopecia, DUPA, right? Where all of your scalp hairs share a balding phenotype in how they present themselves, but even a genotype to what a normal conventional androgenetic alopecia hairline would be. So in other words, a phenotype and genotype that most people have only in their hairline may be spread more broadly across the scalps in some people, creating a sort of more severe DUPA-like condition. And we know that there is a difference between hairs that are balding and hairs that are not, specifically when we look at the typical hairs that bald in the frontal area of the scalp versus the non-balding hairs in the occipital region. If we look at the work of Limbu et al., 2022, titled, quote, Transcriptomic Profiling of Frontal and Occipital Dermal Papilla Reveals Potential Role of TRPS1 in Androgenetic Alopecia, unquote, it looked at differences between the frontal and occipital dermal papilla biology. Now, I'm wondering if this is a sort of sampling kind of issue, because, and here's my sort of understanding of it. If you're only looking for people that have balding issues in the front of their hairline with an occipital region that's largely intact, that might create a notion that the frontal region in every person balds differently than the occipital region, or balds differently than the entirety of the scalp. And we know that this might not be true, so I have a problem with how the study is, I guess, making it out to be. It might create a perception that that is the case, but you have people who bald in their crown first, right? So the findings of Limbu's paper, which is essentially showing that there is a difference between a balding hair, and by proxy they use a balding frontal hair follicle, dermal papilla cell, versus a non-balding hair, and by proxy they use the intact non-balding occipital hair. It's just essentially saying a balding hair follicle has differences compared to a non-balding hair follicle. But we can see that those differences mainly have to do with the dermal papilla activity, right? So I don't want to make this video longer than it already is, but you have various biopsy data showing that this is the case. Data that essentially shows perifollicular inflammation and follicular sponginosis in androgenetic alopecia, as we see with Plaint et al. 2022. We can also see in L. Domiati's male androgenetic alopecia biopsy study that the sample from frontal bald area regions and occipital hairy regions were different. The frontal bald regions showed perifollicular inflammation, collagen deposition, thickening of the perifollicular sheath, and in advanced cases marked by perifollicular fibrosis. And their conclusion in that paper was that over time, the perifollicular sheath thickens, and this is because of increased collagen deposition. So yeah, in my opinion, I think the GPR pathway, well overstated, kind of a bit of a freak out from this paper. It does have some misleading aspects to it for us to kind of freak out about this pathway being wholly relevant when it comes to androgenetic alopecia. I think there's more contradictory evidence in the literature, even from the authors that conducted this paper. Their earlier papers largely contradict this finding of this particular paper that over-exaggerates the GPR pathway. But also, I just want to make a statement too as well. There might be some people that assume if DHT is overexciting this GPR pathway and it's causing some kind of hair follicle damage, does that also apply to androgens like testosterone? And this is a really good question that I got on my channel. And fortunately, I guess in my opinion, the answer appears to be no, at least based on current GPR133 receptor data. And we can look at the study titled, quote, Identification, Structure, and Agonist Design of an Androgen Membrane Receptor, unquote. And this paper examined whether different steroid hormones could activate the GPR133 receptor. And they screened 37 steroid hormones or steroid-like molecules and found that only 5 alpha-reductase dihydrotestosterone, also known as DHT, along with a synthetic androgen known as methanolone, which many of you may know by the brand name of Primobolan, also impacted this pathway, but testosterone didn't do the same. So relax, just because GPR133 is kind of misrepresented and over-exaggerated in Li et al.'s paper, this sort of over-exaggeration of this pathway significance, some people might walk away thinking that even testosterone might also be causing their hair loss through this route. So that was a long ramble. I didn't even mean for this video to get that long, but unfortunately it kind of did. And who knows, maybe you guys aren't even watching this far, but if you're watching this far into the video, comment in the comment section below, blue flowers. Yeah, I haven't done that in a while, but I think, hopefully you guys are paying attention, and if blah, 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 who cares? Anyway, the takeaway here for me is that I think GT20029 is going to be very meaningful, right? If it's able to properly follow its mechanism of action, and so far the clinical signals seem to point in that direction, this is probably going to be a really good treatment. It's probably going to, solve a lot of issues for people who can't use finasteride. And, I can sit here and tell people, use finasteride, titrate the doses. There's just some people that can't use it. And you have to meet people where they are when it comes to these sort of issues with the drug finasteride or dutasteride. I'm fine with dutasteride. I haven't had any problems. So have the majority of people. They haven't had any significant issues with dutasteride. But some people just don't like the idea of crushing DHT, right? So if GT229 is looking like it's going to sort of ameliorate the condition of androgenetic alopecia, it could be good for people who aren't getting good responses on Fin but don't want to commit to dutasteride. It could be good for people who have side effects with Fin or Dut. And it could be good for all of us who want to stack and get better results. So that's the end of this video. Hopefully it wasn't too incoherent. I think it was pretty good. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video. And I'll see you later. Peace.